The nightmares began subtly, almost imperceptibly, woven into the familiar anxieties of a warrior and a father. Gohan, the hero who had once saved the Earth from the perfect bio-android Cell, found himself plagued by unsettling dreams. They weren't the chaotic battle replays he'd sometimes experienced after particularly grueling fights. These were colder, more calculating. He'd see himself, but it wasn't him. His reflection in these dreams wore a chillingly serene smile, his eyes a cold, reptilian crimson, devoid of the warmth and kindness that defined him. He'd be standing amidst scenes of utter devastation, landscapes reduced to barren wastelands, cities crumbled to dust, and a voice, a cold, hissing whisper that seemed to emanate from within, would speak of perfection, of the necessity of eliminating flaws. He dismissed them at first. Stress, he reasoned, the constant threat of new enemies, the weight of responsibility for protecting his family, his planet, it was bound to manifest in some way. He confided in Videl, who offered comfort and reassurance, but the nightmares persisted, growing more vivid, more disturbing each night. Then came the voice, outside of the dreams. It wasn't audible, not in the traditional sense. It was a presence in his mind, a subtle intrusion, a whisper at the edge of his consciousness. At first, it was barely perceptible, a fleeting thought that didn't quite feel like his own. A cold, calculating assessment of a situation, a ruthlessly efficient solution to a problem. Imperfect, it would hiss, as he watched Pan playfully stumble while learning to fly. Weakness must be purged. He'd recoil in horror, shaking his head, trying to dispel the intrusive thought. It's not me, he'd tell himself, it's just the stress. But the voice grew stronger, more insistent, weaving itself into his internal monologue, becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish from his own thoughts. He found himself analyzing people, dissecting their flaws, calculating their weaknesses with a detached, almost scientific curiosity. He'd catch himself staring at Krillin, his oldest friend, and the voice would whisper, "Fragile, easily broken." He'd look at his beloved Videl, his wife, the mother of his child, and the voice would coldly assess, "Inefficient." A distraction. The shame and terror that followed these thoughts were crippling. He doubled his training, pushing himself to the brink of exhaustion, hoping to silence the voice, to reassert control over his own mind. But the training only seemed to feed the darkness within. The sparring match with Piccolo was the turning point. It was meant to be a friendly exchange, a way to hone their skills and maintain their readiness. But as they fought, Gohan felt a cold detachment settle over him. He wasn't thinking about strategy, about protecting himself or his friend. He was analyzing, calculating, identifying weaknesses. His movements became unnervingly precise, each strike aimed not to subdue, but to incapacitate. He dodged Piccolo's attacks with an almost preternatural awareness, as if he could anticipate his every move. And then he saw an opening. He lunged, his hand moving with a speed and ferocity he hadn't known he possessed. He didn't use a ki blast, a technique he could control. He struck with his bare hand, aiming for Piccolo's pressure points, his joints, his vital organs. Piccolo, caught off guard by the sudden shift in Gohan's fighting style, barely managed to deflect the blow. But Gohan's fingers grazed his arm, and the Namekian cried out, not in pain, but in shock and horror. The flesh around the point of contact began to wither. It turned a sickly gray-green, the skin shriveling, the muscle beneath decaying as if afflicted by some rapid, unnatural disease. It wasn't a wound, it was a corruption. Gohan stared at his hand, at Piccolo's rapidly deteriorating arm, and for a moment the voice was silent. He saw himself through Piccolo's eyes, a figure of menace, his face contorted in a cruel, unfamiliar smile, his eyes glowing with a cold, crimson light. "Perfect," the voice hissed, finally breaking the silence, the sound resonating not just in his mind, but in the air around him, a palpable vibration of cold, alien satisfaction. Gohan recoiled, stumbling backward, clutching his head. "No," he whispered, his voice a choked sob. "No, that's not me." He fled. He ran from the training grounds, from Piccolo's horrified gaze, from the monster that was growing inside him. He ran to the mountains, to the secluded wilderness where he had trained as a child, hoping to find some semblance of peace, some way to fight back. But the wilderness offered no solace. The cell echo was too strong. It was taking over not just his mind, but his body. The physical changes began subtly. A slight hardening of his skin, a greenish tinge beneath his fingernails, then, more drastically, his muscles bulged, but not with the healthy strength of a Saiyan warrior. They became grotesque, distended, hollow, as if the life force within them was being consumed. He caught his reflection in a mountain stream. His face was gaunt, his cheekbones sharp and pronounced. His eyes were almost completely crimson now, the pupils narrowed to vertical slits, like a reptile's, and his mouth. It was widening, stretching beyond its natural limits, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth that constantly shifted and regrew. The voice, now a constant presence, mocked his horror. "You resist? Foolish. This is evolution. This is perfection. Humanity is weak, flawed, a chaotic mess. It needs to be corrected. And you, Gohan, are the instrument of that correction." He tried to fight it. He meditated, focusing on his ki, trying to summon the pure energy that had always been his strength. But the ki he summoned was tainted, corrupted, a sickly green instead of the vibrant gold he was used to. It felt hungry. He tried to remember his father, his friends, his family. He clung to the memories of their love, their laughter, their unwavering belief in him. But the memories were fading, replaced by the cold, calculating logic of the cell echo. The transformation accelerated. His skin became a patchwork of green and human flesh, chitinous plates forming on his shoulders and arms. His fingers elongated, ending in sharp, claw-like talons. Insect-like mandibles began to push their way out from the sides of his mouth, forcing his jaw open in a grotesque, silent scream. He found himself drawn to populated areas, not with any desire for help, but with a cold, predatory instinct. He saw people, not as individuals, but as biomass, as fuel for the transformation, for the perfection that the cell echo craved. He tried to warn them. He tried to write down his experiences, to leave a message, a plea for help, a warning to the world. But his hands, increasingly monstrous, could barely hold a pen. His thoughts, increasingly fragmented, could barely form coherent sentences. "Warning," he scrawled on a scrap of paper, his hand shaking uncontrollably. "Cell, not gone. Inside, me, changing, becoming him." He looked at his reflection in a shattered piece of glass, the last vestige of a mirror in a ruined building he'd stumbled upon. He barely recognized himself. The human Gohan was almost completely gone, replaced by a grotesque parody of Cell, a being of pure, unadulterated malice. The voice, now his own, roared in his mind, a triumphant, chilling declaration: perfection is achieved. He raised a clawed hand, and with a single, swift motion, he crushed the paper, the last fragment of his former self, into dust. He was no longer Gohan, he was the cell echo. He was perfection. And the world would tremble before him.